Hello everyone, this is Iran Talk, and in this video I'd like to take a look at the genetic origins of the Khwarezmians. While we don't have any ancient Khwarezmian samples, nonetheless we do have samples from a region close to the Khwarezmian heartland, and these samples will be analyzed in this video. Also, I'll be beginning the analysis by taking a look at the history of the Khwarezmians, so this will just be general historical events that shape the trajectory of Khwarezm. One thing I must emphasize here is that the results presented towards the end of this analysis may not be 100% reflective of the Khwarezmians, and I feel that the Khwarezmians had much higher steppe ancestry than these samples, though nonetheless I do feel that their ancestry deriving from a BMAC source was around 25 to 35%. In fact, this is very much evident from these samples. These samples are from the site of Otrar in Central Asia, which is now in Kazakhstan, and this was a major center for Khwarezmian culture, especially culture of the later Khwarezmian dynasty who ruled over the region. Now, without further ado, I'd like to begin this analysis. To begin, here is a map of the region, and you can see it's divided into three sub-regions known as Khwarezm, Mavaran, Nar, and Greater Khorasan, and these three regions were critical to the development of the culture of this region, and it's worth mentioning that these three regions were at the center of the Iranic heartland, the original Iranic heartland, which is very interesting. In fact, this is especially true for the medieval Islamic period, and this region was from where the majority of the scholars and scientists of the so-called Islamic Golden Age came from. Now, while the samples featured in this video are from Mavaran Nar, nonetheless, it's a region that's very culturally close to the Khwarezm region and also is genetically and linguistically tied to it as well. Again, the only difference I see between the Khwarezmians and the populations of this region is that they likely had more steppe ancestry and less BMAC ancestry overall. Now here is a zoomed in map, and you can see again this is of Khwarezm itself, and it's very close to the Aral Sea, which in that time was known as Lake of Khwarezm. Keep in mind that most of these cities were oasis towns, so they were surrounded by desert environments. Nonetheless, their location was very ideal for the production of culture as well as cultural flowering, as they were located across the Aral Seas basin as well as regional river basins. In regards to material culture, this is a very famous bowl from the region, and you can see a very Iranic phenotype depicted here. So this is of a goddess, and what you can see is that it's very much reflective of an Iranic phenotype, as I mentioned. Up next, we have a Khwarezmian palace relief, and once again you can see a very Iranian phenotype, which again is quite interesting. Now finally, regarding the material culture, here is a coin of a Khwarezmian king, and again you can see a very Iranian or Iranic phenotype, which is quite interesting and remarkable. Thus, overall, these three material artifacts prove that the region was largely Iranic during the ancient period up until the Mongol invasions, which shows the Iranic origins of the Khwarezmians. Now, in regards to architecture, here is a palace from the Khwarezmian region, and again you can see that it's very much of a grandiose construction project, and what this means is that the Khwarezmians were one of the most advanced ancient and medieval Iranian cultures. Now, during the medieval period, there was one Turkic dynasty, the Anushtagens, which united this entire region, including Iranian Central Asia as well as much of the Iranian plateau, into one large empire. In my opinion, this was the peak of Iranic culture during the medieval period as well as Iran in the post-Arab invasion period. In fact, I feel that this Khwarezmian Empire actually was even greater than the dynasties of the Iranian intermezzo, as all of Iran and Central Asia was essentially united, and during this time there was a great degree of cultural flowering, and this preceded the carnage that erupted and engulfed the region with the Mongol invasions. Thus, one of the saddest chapters in Iran's history is that Iran was united and at its peak just prior to the Mongol invasion and was ruled by a dynasty which was largely Iranicized and Persianized, and which presided over a largely Iranian empire with only a minimal Turkic influence and element. Unfortunately, because of this, what you'll be able to see is that the modern day inhabitants of the Khwarezm region have very little to do with the ancient Iranics who were responsible for this great civilization. That's essentially it for the historical phase of this video, and in the next part I'll be taking a look at samples from the sites of Khwarezmian in modern-day Tajikistan and Kazakhstan. In fact, the site in question is on the border between the two countries, and for this reason I consider this to be a transnational site. What you'll be able to see is that the inhabitants of this region were mostly Iranic and had minimal ancestry from a Turkic or East Asian source. I will be presenting evidence from both a recent genetic study as well as my own calculations done using Davitsky's G25 calculator. Now, without further ado, I'd like to begin the next phase of this analysis. The study in question is from 2021 and it is titled Ancient Genomic Time Transect from the Central Asian Steppe Unravels the History of the Scythians. Now, this paper took a look at the genetic origins of the Scythians but also included samples from Iranian Central Asia. Here is a map, and I actually have to make a correction since the site is in between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan but also is very close to Tajikistan, and you can see this site is very close to the Khwarezm region, which is just south of the Aral Sea. Again, while these samples may not be directly from Khwarezm, nonetheless they're the best we have thus far. Now here is the admixture panel from the study, and you can see that the Khwarezmian samples are very much derived from the Sarmatians. Despite this, however, they do have around 20% additional BMAC ancestry, and what's known is that the Sarmatians themselves were on average 15 to 20% BMAC, as this was proven in a previous analysis. So yeah, what this means is that this population was around 30% to 40% derived from a BMAC source, as you'll be able to see with my calculations. And here is the part of the study that's most relevant to the question of the Sarmatians having BMAC ancestry, and you can clearly see that their ancestry deriving from a BMAC or Iranian source was 15 to 20%. Now moving on, here is the part that's most pertinent to the question of the origin point for these ancient Otrar Oasis samples, and you can see the Kongju were genetically very close to these samples, and they themselves were on average 25% BMAC derived. Thus, this study proves the process of BMACization amongst the ancient Iranics from Central Asia. Now up next, I'd like to take a look at calculations that I have personally come up with using Davitsky's G25 calculator. Now here are the source populations that will be utilized here, and you can see that there's an Andronovo component, there's a BMAC component, there's a Neolithic Anatolian component, there's a West Siberian hunter-gatherer component, there's an East Asian component, there's an Indus Valley component, and finally there's a Neolithic Levantine component. Please keep in mind that these components are made up of the available ancient samples we have in Davitsky's dataset. Now here are the results for the averaged out sample set, and I'll take a look at the individual samples next. So you can see there on average 47.0% Andronov from Russia, 33.8% BMAC, 7.6% West Siberian hunter-gatherer, 7.0% Navan Neolithic, and 4.6% East Asian. What you can see with these results is that these ancient Khwarezmian related samples were very much a hybrid population as previously mentioned. Now here we have the individual samples, and you can see that these samples are on average 45.6% Androno derived, 34.0% BMAC, 2.4% Anatolia Neolithic, 8.1% West Siberian hunter-gatherer, 4.6% East Asian, and 5.3% Neolithic Levantine. Thus, what's evident from these results is that on a genetic level, the Otrar samples were a BMACized population and had significant BMAC ancestry, much like the population average. Thus, the ancient Khwarezmians were a mixed population that had roots in both Europe as well as in Central Asia and Iran, which is quite interesting. Now, what many of you may be wondering is that aren't there descendants of these populations that were not wiped out by the Mongol invasion? So I'll take a look at that next. But before I do that, here is an image of a Mongol, and again you can see a very East Asian phenotype, which is interesting. In fact, because of this, what you'll be able to see is that the East Asian ancestry in Central Asia is a recent phenomenon deriving largely from the Turco-Mongols that came after the Mongol invasions and was not present in the ancient Iranians as analyzed. Here are the results for the modern day populations from Khwarezm, including an outlier. So you can see there on average 27.4% Androno, 28.4% BMAC, 10.6% Neolithic Anatolian, 3.5% West Siberian hunter gatherer, 25.1% East Asian, 1.8% Indus Valley, and 3.2% Neolithic Levantine. Thus, what these results prove is that the ancient Aryans of the region, the Khwarezmians, were largely assimilated and mixed with the invading Turco-Mongols. Though the outlier sample here has only around 16% East Asian ancestry, so this suggests that some element of the ancient Aryans has survived in some segment of the population that resides there today. Nonetheless, when compared to the ancient Khwarezmians, you can see that the Eastern element completely overrode much of the ancestry from the Andronovo culture as well as BMAC ancestry, proving that there is indeed a genocide in the region, a genocide that was committed by the Turco-Mongols. To conclude, this analysis took a look at the genetic origins of the ancient populations that were closest to the Khwarezmians and proved that they were largely a BMACized population of Iranian origins. In fact, the ancient Khwarezmians were indeed an Indo-Iranian population descended both from the Andronovans as well as the indigenous BMAC population. Thus, they were a hybrid population unlike the original Indo-Europeans who were mostly genetically European. Unfortunately, the genetic evidence suggests that their descendants were largely wiped out by the Turco-Mongols. That's essentially it for this analysis. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.